Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Ghost Rider 1, cover dated February of 1967. This issue marks the first appearance of the Ghost Rider, but not the one you're thinking of. This version is a Western gunslinger named Carter Slade, whose series ran for 7 issues before being cancelled. He's fallen into relative obscurity since, but has made occasional appearances throughout the years. But in any case, let's get back to the issue at hand, which was written by Gary Friedrich and Roy Thomas, drawn by Dick Ayers, inked by Vince Colletta, and lettered by John Verpoorten. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, showing Carter Slade on horseback, having stumbled on an Indian raid. While he's just a schoolteacher, he can't stand by as the Indians senselessly burn down a frontier settlement. So he rushes in with rifle in hand, and begins firing at the Indians. They of course fire back, but Slade notices that something's off. From what he's heard, the Indians in the area are supposed to be peaceful, yet these ones are violent and speak in a strange way. Well, whatever it may be, he doesn't have time to worry about it now, as he's found himself surrounded by the Indians. So he tries to stave them off with his rifle, but gets knocked off of his horse and drops it. At this point, any normal person would just give up, but Slade's not a quitter, as he then tries to take down the Indians with his fists alone. Yet despite being a college boxing champion, he can't brunt a bullet straight to the chest. Thus he collapses to the ground, but with the last of his strength, he grabs a nearby rock and hurls it at an Indian. It knocks off the warrior's headdress, revealing underneath a head of brown, unmistakably European hair. Thus it's revealed that the Indians aren't actually Indians, but white men posing. It's not clear what they're up to, but apparently they work for some boss, and are trying to scare away homesteaders. But whatever their mission is, they've got no reason to stick around. So with Slade on the verge of death, they ride away. Several quiet hours then pass, until the trapdoor of a burnt-down farmhouse begins to creak open. Out comes Jamie Jacobs, the young son of a slain settler. He'd been hiding in his family cellar, and is the raid's only survivor. That is unless you count Slade, as he's miraculously still alive. So Jamie, being a kind and courageous boy, heaves Slade's weak body onto his horse, and then begins leading it to the nearest town, in the hopes that he can get him medical attention. But in the haze of it all, Jamie accidentally steps off in the wrong direction. Thus after many hours of travel, he tiredly collapses, no closer to any settlement than when he began. But he's in luck, for just as night falls, a band of Indians happens to stumble onto them. These ones aren't posers, but the peaceful and compassionate tribe that Slade had heard of. So the Indians take Jamie and Slade back to their camp, and to their medicine man, Flaming Star. He prays for mercy from the Great Spirit, but after 8 days of endless chanting, Flaming Star declares Slade a lost cause. But then, in a manner-defying explanation, the brave schoolteacher suddenly rises from the brink of death, wholly healed of his wounds. Flaming Star is astonished by the miracle, and concludes that Slade must be the prophesied champion known as the White Warrior. Flaming Star explains that many seasons ago, he climbed to the top of a tall mountain, and asked the Great Spirit to send a sign of his faith in him. So the Spirit cast a meteorite through the sky, and bathed him in a strange glowing dust. He was then instructed to hold onto the dust, until the day that a great champion appeared. It seems that day has arrived, as Flaming Star hands Slade the container of the dust, and remarks that it will give him the power of the mystic spirits. But there's still something missing, as the White Warrior must have a worthy steed. So Flaming Star takes Slade to a high hill overlooking the rolling plains. Below them is a herd of wild horses, the most magnificent being a white steed known as the Ghost Horse. The Indians believe it to contain the spirit of a god, and have never been able to wrangle it. But Slade fares better, for instead of trying to capture it with a lasso, he gently approaches it in a friendly manner. Thus the Ghost Horse takes a liking to him, and is tamed for the first time in its life. But Slade doesn't like the name Ghost Horse, so he instead decides to call his new friend, Banshee. With that, the issue shifts forward 2 days later, as Slade is preparing to leave the Indian camp, and seek out his new destiny as the White Warrior. But he won't be going alone, as he's decided to adopt the orphan Jamie. The pair are headed for the school that Slade's going to teach at, so they bid Flaming Star and his tribe farewell, and head off for the long journey ahead of them. So let's skip past the hours of tedious travel, and pick up with our pair as they've made camp for the night, and as Slade is experimenting with the glowing dust. He's just discovered that it reflects light 1,000 times its actual brightness. Thinking practically, Slade realizes that if treated on a white costume, the glowing dust would make it seem as if he were a phantom or ghost. The same could be also done to Banshee's coat, and he could then operate as a vigilante, striking fear into the hearts of evildoers. And so the next night, Slade emerges from the darkness as a new hero, the Ghost Rider. He's fashioned himself an all-white costume, flanked by a revolver on each hip. He can manipulate the glowing dust that covers it, and make it seem as though he's nothing but a disembodied head. With his costume and steed, he'll avenge the death of Jamie's parents, and protect the West from all who seek evil. But before we get a chance to see him in action, the issue suddenly shifts focus to the sprawling ranch of a man named Jason Bartholomew, the one who'd hired the white men to pose as violent Indians. You see, he's a rancher, and wants to scare away the settlers so he can claim all of the land for himself, and build on it a cattle empire. But there's another obstacle in his way, as the settlers are building a new schoolhouse, the one that Slade's set to teach at. Of course this can't be allowed to go through, as it'll just attract more settlers to the area. So he orders his band of raiders to burn it down, and take a hostage. Thus exactly 2 hours later, the phony Indians arrive at the school and begin firing into the air. They're not there to kill anyone, as they're afraid that they'll bring too much attention to themselves and get the army involved. But they're still there to sow chaos and burn down the school, so they light it ablaze, and then take their hostage. She's a schoolteacher, or at least has been acting as one in Slade's absence. So they toss her onto one of their horses and then ride away, with the promise that she'll be returned if the settlers clear out. But before we shift focus back to Slade, it should be noted that the settlers weren't fooled by the white men, as they could easily tell they weren't actual Indians. But back to Slade, who's just arrived at the school, as all the settlers are packing their things. He asks what's going on, and they recount what we just saw. But they also tell him about Jason Bartholomew, who they rightly suspect is behind the raid. Realizing that he might be able to stop him, Slade entrusts Jamie in the care of the settlers, and heads off to become the Ghost Rider. So the issue then shifts focus to Bartholomew's ranch, as his raiders have brought him their hostage. But this is the opposite of what he wanted, as they've just revealed to her that he's the one behind the plot. Enraged by their stupidity, Bartholomew enters into a bitter tirade, but is interrupted as the lights suddenly go out. His men scramble to fix the room's lamp, but before their eyes can get adjusted to the darkness, they all find themselves bathed in an unearthly glow. It's the Ghost Rider, or more accurately, the Ghost Rider's head. He announces himself as the spirit of justice, and demands a confession out of Bartholomew. But a brash and frightened raider doesn't give his boss the chance to speak, as he pulls out a revolver and fires at the rider. It's unclear if he misses the shot, or if the rider just tanks it, but the hero then blacks out his entire costume, and begins laughing like a madman. At this point the raiders are scared witless, and are fleeing in terror. But the rider won't let them escape, as under the cover of darkness, he begins beating them up one by one. But he's not there for a bunch of sniveling cowards, he's there for Bartholomew. So he lets the raiders go, but promises them unmerciful vengeance if they ever come back. He then turns his attention to Bartholomew, who's just shot him from point-blank range. Yet the rider's completely unfazed by the bullet, and then somehow makes his body transparent. It's unclear how he's able to do this, as an editor's note mentions that it'll be explained in the next issue. Regardless, the rider then wails on a stunned Bartholomew, and brings the battered Baron to his knees. He then turns the light back on, and offers Bartholomew mercy. He'll let him go, but only if he never returns, and surrenders himself to federal authorities. Bartholomew readily agrees to this bargain, and so the rider lets him free. The issue then shifts forward an hour later, as Slade's made his way back to the settlement. The hostage had made her way back too, and has told all of the townsfolk of the Ghost Rider's heroic rescue. But as for the raiders he'd let free, well, they'd surrendered themselves to the settlers, and have been ushered to the authorities. Slade pretends that all of this is news to him, and then remarks that it's an opportunity to rebuild, and start anew. So the issue subsequently ends as Slade and Jamie mount their horses, and head off for the plot of land that's to be their new home. That concludes Ghost Rider 1, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a surprisingly solid story. I honestly didn't expect much from the issue going into it, as I figured it was just gonna be a boring and cliché western that didn't fit with the rest of Marvel's superhero stuff. I can't say that it reinvented the wheel, but it did turn out to be a fun and exciting little story. So while it's the first Western comic that I've reviewed, I can say with confidence that it won't be my last. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching. And happy Halloween!